Today we'll be starting with chapter 8, which is titled Human Nutrition. And in this chapter, we will be talking about diet. So, why do we need to eat? And how do we need to eat? What are the things we need? And along with that, we'll talk about what happens when we don't get enough of nutrition of a certain kind. Then we'll talk about the effects of each, the major categories, after which we'll move on to talking about the human digestive system, which will begin with talking about the teeth and their roles in digestion, and then moving on to the organs that are involved in digestion and uptake of nutrients, right? So the teeth break down food physically, so that's physical digestion. The organs are involved in the chemical breakdown of uh, the matter in the food, that's chemical digestion. And right following that, that's right. So there is a bit of information in this chapter. Let's get started with those details. So first up, diet. So the very first question is, why in the world do we need food, right? So we've just come out of talking about plants, and plants make their own food, right? And they need it for growth and repair and energy to perform cellular functions. And that's basically all the reasons why we need food as well, right? Or any living organism needs food, right? The difference is that plants are able to make their own food, whereas many, or like I would say perhaps maybe the majority of other organisms are dependent on plants or other animals as their food source. So they eat rather than produce their own, right? And so the need for food is for growth, repair, right? And basically, as a source of energy. This is slightly detailed in the text, right? But there's nothing, you know, special about what they've given, so you can just take a read about that when you go through the chapter. Now, what kind of diet do we want? We want a balanced diet. What does a balanced diet contain, right? It contains all the essential nutrients in correct proportions. So let me write that. In correct proportions to maintain good health. Right, and so what are the kind of nutrients we need? Those include carbohydrates, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins. So we're familiar with these guys. Water, right? Water is also essential. Then you've got vitamins, minerals, and fiber. So that is the definition of a balanced diet. Now, obviously, each of these have their particular role to play. So carbohydrates are our primary source of energy, plus, right, they're used, uh, right, as energy stores. They're also used as part of proteins or lipids in various structures in the body, right? Then proteins are obviously make up the bulk of any living organism. Lipids are important, making up the cell membranes or hormones, and then the vitamins and minerals and roughage in water all go together. So different foods have different uh, percentages of, and so when we choose which food to consume, we need to be careful that we don't overdo any one. Right? Some foods are scientifically and nutritionally better than, and so right, we choose which ones. So we talk about healthy foods, right? So obviously having chips and ice cream and all of that, those are not considered part of any, balanced or nutrition, healthy diet. They could be taken very occasionally, very rarely, but of course that's not how we actually do it. Okay, so let's talk about the different classes of food. Let's start with carbohydrates. All right, so the three classes of food, followed by uh, vitamins and minerals. So as far as classes of food are concerned, there's three of those. So the very first one are carbohydrates, and you could get them from foods such as potatoes and maize and rice and cereal, and many of these contain starch. Right, so starch is built up from glucose to maltose to starch, and that's how it's broken down in the body as well. We'll talk about digestion obviously later on. There's sucrose, which is naturally available in certain foods, and it's also the common table sugar that we consume. And then there's glucose and fructose, which is available in many fruits and right, some vegetables. So carbohydrates provide us with the most ready available source of energy, and the body is actually primed, it is built to process carbohydrates first, right? It is programmed to process carbohydrates first. So carbohydrates, as we know, are built up of the elements carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Take any carbohydrate and they'll have only these three elements. And right, we'll talk about respiration later. So glucose is important for respiration. So right, it's not just that it's like it is all linked together, right? The reason we say carbohydrates are a ready source of energy is because the cells in our like throughout our body are able to process glucose to get energy, right? That happens easily. So, and obviously we'll talk about respiration later on in another chapter. How much energy do carbohydrates provide per gram of carbohydrate? They provide 16 kilojoules of energy. So that's for carbohydrates. And obviously, if we eat in excess because they are a ready source of energy, so if we eat in excess, right, the body doesn't need it at the moment, and so they are converted to storage forms, right, which could be either glycogen, which is a short-term store, or right, lipids, which are long-term stores, right? So fat deposits. Now, a mention over here is about cellulose, and cellulose is what makes up the cell walls of plants, right? So if we eat plant matter, which is right, we get a lot of nutrients from plant matter, vegetables, leaves. We eat leaves and stalks and fruits. Off vegetables are technically fruits, right? Scientifically speaking, right, they are the fruit of that plant. In many cases, so right, cellulose is what makes up the plant cell walls, and so when you consume vegetables, you're obviously also consuming cellulose. The thing is that humans or mammals, I wouldn't say mammals in general, but humans, right, aren't able to digest cellulose. And so obviously it remains undigested. But it is useful. Why? Because it is what we call the fiber. So we should have fiber in a diet. That fiber is the cellulose, right? Or roughage, right? And it helps in healthy digestion. How does it help in healthy digestion? Right? It helps in the process that we'll talk about, like we mentioned later, right? It helps in peristalsis, right? Which is the movement of your alimentary canal, the movement of the walls of the alimentary canal. So if you have fiber in your diet, you're going to have healthy bowel movements, as they're called, which is basically peristalsis, and so digestion will be, it will be taking place properly. Animals such as cows, right, or ruminant animals, ruminant, animals, right? Ruminant animals are the ones that have a second stomach. And right, they're able to digest cellulose not because their body produces the enzymes for that digestion, but because their bacteria in their gut that is right. So their bacteria in their gut that are able to digest cellulose. So they produce the enzyme for that digestion, able to produce enzyme to digest cellulose. Any questions?
No.
Okay. Next up are lipids. And right, sources are right meat and milk and egg yolk, and these are animal sources. And from plants, you can get them from you know their oils and seeds. By the way, on a side note, lipids are sometimes called fats, and those are just the lipids that are solids at room temperature. And so those are mostly the ones that are coming from animals, whereas the ones that are called oils, they're also lipids, but they are liquid mostly, right, at room temperature. Well, not mostly, right? Oil meaning liquid at room temperature. And so most of the lipids sourced from plants are oils. And so obviously the major, use of lipids for us to know is the cell membranes of the cell. So obviously, right, throughout your body. And they can be used to provide energy, so they can be used in the process of respiration and provide twice as much energy as, or more than twice, in fact, compared to carbohydrates. So, right, a single gram of lipid can give you 37 kilojoules of energy, right? Carbohydrate was 6, so twice of that is 32, and this is giving you 37. Again, the problem is that as long as you are providing your body with any form of carbohydrate that can be digested, that will be its primary source. So there are sort of fasts and diet routines and plans where you have to avoid carbohydrates entirely or just not eat for a particular period of time, right? Intermittent fasting. And again, this is obviously not in your syllabus, but just, a side note. And so if you want to utilize the fat, like if you're gaining weight, you want to lose it, or you just want to not have a lot of fat deposit in your body, then you need to force your body to consume it. It will get around to doing it, but first it will consume the glucose that is available in the blood, and then it will go to the stores of carbohydrates in the body. And once all of that is depleted and there's no carbohydrate around, then it will get to processing fat. So it takes time.
So that's the reason that athletes consume lipids days before the marathon and all.
They consume what? Lipids.
Yeah,
Well, the thing is that, athletes, like, if you're talking about athletes that, are marathon runner or something, they would actually require better sources of carbohydrates because, right, in a 100-meter sprint, it's like so short, your body is not going to utilize any fats. Utilization of fats is a long-term process, right? But yes, if they're consuming, like, that's in the sense of stores. But if they're consuming, like, it's called a keto diet, and so if they're consuming more lipids and they're working out, obviously, so they don't wake up in the morning and said, "Oh, today I'm going to run a marathon," or "Today I'm going to go for a 100-meter sprint." So obviously, right, the reason they switch to fats is, right, it provides more energy in general, and so, right, when they work out, they have more energy to do what they want to do, right, as opposed to using carbohydrates, because in those terms carbohydrates are not as efficient, right? They provide less energy, and, right, you store up the rest as fats anyway. Does that answer your question?
yeah,
Okay. uh, all fats are insulating, so they can, you know uh, sort of limit the heat loss from your body. It's not as effective in humans, but animals that live in the cold temperature, right? Walruses and seals and whales and all of these, like polar bears or bears in general that hibernate during the winter, they have lots of fats in their body because it works as an energy source for them, as well as protecting them from the cold, right? So uh, fats insulate body, right? They reduce heat loss. Okay, next up, proteins. So protein sources are lean meat, fish, egg, milk, and then you've got sources from plants. So all plants contain some level, like some percentage of proteins, but then there's some that are better than others, and those include soybeans and pumpkin seeds and nuts. Right, so those are some of the best sources. And so we know that proteins are made up of amino acids. So plants are able to take nitrates from the soil and make their own amino acids. We get amino acids from plants, basically, either directly or indirectly. Either we eat vegetables or we eat the animals that have eaten the vegetables, right? So the meat that we consume is from herbivores, right? And so they've eaten plants, and so they have the amino acids, right? And so, right, provides amino acids for protein. So we take proteins in our diet, digest them down to amino acids, and then use them to build up our own. Right? We need different kinds of proteins. So it's sort of like Lego, right? Building blocks. You have building blocks. You have a structure, right? You made something, and you break it down into its pieces, and then you make, something else. You make, right? And so, right, Obviously, you're using the C, and you'd go like, well, you have those proteins, yes, but I don't want the ones that are available. I want to make something new, right? They're both using the same building blocks. And so, right, proteins are there throughout the body. You have, right, your skin, muscle, blood, bones, in the cells, enzymes, hormones, right? They're everywhere, right? All cellular processes, and we'll talk about DNA and protein and everything later. So basically, what the DNA does is it instructs the cell to make certain proteins, right? So proteins are everywhere. Now, right, amino acids that we consume, right, cannot be stored as amino acids. So amino acids cannot be stored as amino acids. That is something that we lack. And so what happens is in the liver, they are deaminated. So there's a process called deamination where this particular group is removed. This is called the amine group, right? So that amine group is removed from the amino acids, and then they are converted to glycogen, which is a carbohydrate. And that is stored. The energy that proteins can provide, so that is also, right, just about as much as a carbohydrate, uh, and that is 17 kilojoules per gram. Now, chemically, uh, proteins are different from carbohydrates and lipids because carbohydrates are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Lipids are mostly carbon and hydrogen with some oxygen, and proteins have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sometimes sulfur. That's something we've covered earlier on, I believe, as well. And so I'm just mentioning that verbally. Any questions so far?
No.
Okay. So those are the three food classes, but we're not done, right? So balanced diet also requires vitamins or vitamins as you prefer. So we'll talk about those. Now, what are these guys, right? These are certain chemicals, right? They're organic molecules that are all different, right? And so they have certain effects on the health of our body, and so they are classified into this general group called vitamins, right? But they don't have any features in common, such as the structure or the elements that make them up or whatever, right? So uh, carbohydrates are all carbohydrate, oxygen, and so we can't say the same for vitamins, right? They don't have any particular structures in common or makeup or anything, but some of the features, some of their actions, very generally, right? Not specifically. Specifically, they're very different. So they are a group of organic substances that have different chemical structures, and they are important for our health. Let me just write that down. Right now, as with talk on balanced diet, everything needs to be taken in a certain amount. You don't want to overdose and you don't want to have less, right? Because in either case, that is uh, undesirable and it will have some negative effect. Now, in case of vitamins, there are some common features for them, as I mentioned, generally, and so right, they are not digested or broken down for energy, right? So they are not a source of energy for us. Then they are not built into body structures, right? So carbohydrates are incorporated into the body or used for respiration. So are proteins. They are made into enzymes or whatever, and lipids, right? The cell membrane, and so these are not incorporated. They're not built into body structures. Usually, sometimes maybe in some cases, but in general, no. Then they are vital for health in small quantities. So you need very little of them. And they are needed for chemical reactions in the cells. They work alongside enzymes. Now, the fun thing is that plants can make their own proteins, they can make their own lipids, they can make their own carbohydrates, they can make their own vitamins, right? And so animals, whether they're goats and cows or birds that take seeds, right, or fruit, or us who eat either plants directly or eat other animals, right? Or other animals that eat other animals like lions and hippos and well, hippos are herbivores, so I think I don't know whether they eat fish or not. Anyway, so right, point is that the source of vitamins for everyone and everything are plants, right? So can make their own vitamins and animals get them from plants. Now there are about or at least 15 vitamins that have been identified, ranging from vitamin A and B and C and D and E, and then there's K, and I don't know if there's anything in between or after that. And there are a lot of B vitamins, right? So B1, B2, B12, B6, and others. That's called the vitamin B complex. The important thing is that they're generally classified into either being water soluble or fat soluble. Right, so water soluble vitamins uh, are present in green leaves, fruits, and cereals. whereas fat soluble are found in animal fats and vegetable oils. Now, there are obviously some other details about this, but they haven't really given those details here. There's a bit of focus on vitamins C and D, so let's talk about that. Right, vitamin C is, I believe, a water-soluble vitamin, and so right, having too much is also harmful, but having very little of it, right, has it leads to diseases because they are required by the body for certain functions, and when there isn't enough of a particular vitamin, then its deficiency leads to conditions that would be classified as diseases or some sort of malnutrition, right? And so to you know make things proper, you obviously you know eat the have that vitamin in your diet either naturally or in the form of supplement. So let's talk about vitamin C. Right, so it's present in all citrus fruits. So right now is the season. You've got all sorts of oranges. So best time to get lots of vitamin C. The problem is that it's water soluble, and so you can't really store it in your body. Right, any excess is removed. Citrus fruits. Right, then there are others such as black currants and guavas, mangoes and cabbages. So good for us, right? We've got guavas here, we've got mangoes here, and we've also got cabbage, which is obviously a vegetable. And so they're required for healthy skin and gum. And when you know what they're required for, what's required for, you can imagine what would happen if you don't have enough of it in the body when there's a deficiency, right? So a deficiency, right, which means you're not having enough of this vitamin, or right, a deficiency of anything in any circumstance means there's not enough. So deficiency of vitamin C, and right, you write the alphabet capital for whatever vitamin it is. So for vitamin C, the deficiency, it causes a condition called scurvy. Now, what happens in this condition? Fibers in connective tissue of skin and blood vessels don't form properly. So these are not, the fibers of cellulose you're talking about. Fibers are basically these long thread-like molecular structures, right? So fibers that hold, the structure together as a whole. You could consider them something like you've seen construction work going on, and you see that they use steel rods. They use them during construction. Have you seen that happening?
Yeah.
Right? And so those steel rods provide strength to the building, the structure, right? And then they put the cement on it. So the steel rods hold the cement together. If you just make a pile of cement, you will never be able to make the building. Right? Not only does it hold it together, it provides the physical strength to make the building and live in it, etc., etc. So kind of like that, perhaps not exactly, but kind of. So right, in connective tissue, and blood vessels, right? They don't form properly. And so, what do you think would happen, right? You end up with bleeding under the skin. You're bleeding under the skin, and right, you get bleeding gums, and along with that, you are like you're always tired, weak, irritable, right? So you easily get irritated by even the smallest things. Then you end up with joint pains and swollen and bleeding gums, right? And in severe cases, right, your teeth can fall out. Now, we don't come across this problem nowadays. We get enough vitamin C in different forms, but right, it used to be called, if I'm not mistaken, sailor's disease back in the day when people used to go on long sea voyages and they would have very limited food, and so they wouldn't get enough vitamin C, and so they would develop these conditions. Right? Obviously, the remedy is, as he mentioned, take vitamin C. Either eat fruits and foods with vitamin C, or take supplements. Now we do have a bit of time, so I want to sort of complete the topic of vitamins, and so let's talk about vitamin D. Do you have any questions about what we just talked about?
No.
Okay. So vitamin D, right? This is the only vitamin that the body can produce. How? So there's a chemical present in our skin, right, that is converted to vitamin D, but for that our skin needs to be exposed to sunlight. And obviously the best time for that is in the morning, early morning sunlight. If you know have enough exposure of to sunlight on our skin, then right we won't need any supplements for vitamin D. Having too little or too much of sunlight, both can cause problems. Less would cause vitamin D deficiency, obviously, and too much can lead to other problems, right? So, and then obviously the skin color. So, right, darker skin, right, means that sunlight is less effective, which in a way is good because you won't be affected as much by the harmful, radiation that comes along with the sun, the UV radiation, all that. But then also affects vitamin D being formed in the body, even if you are exposed to the sun, right? So give and take. So some of that is listed in the text. I'm going to move on talking about its role in our diet. We can get vitamin D from fish and butter and milk and cheese and eggs. Fish, fish oil, butter, cheese, milk, eggs, right? And You obviously have vitamin D supplements as well. Now, what vitamin D does is it helps in the absorption of calcium and phosphorus from the gut. And why do we need these two things? Because our bones are made up of calcium phosphate, right? So we need calcium and phosphorus. If we don't have calcium and phosphorus coming in, our bones will weaken, especially during our growing phases, but later on as well, right? And so a lack of vitamin D results in bones not getting enough calcium and phosphorus, and so they become soft. So a leads deficiency leads to soft bones. Why? Because you're not taking in calcium and phosphate, right? And when that happens, especially in the legs, right, the bones are not able to withstand the weight of the body itself. Cannot bear the body's weight. And so what happens is you end up with a condition called rickets, in which the legs are deformed. Rickets, where you have deformed legs. Now, this mostly happens in children, right? In adults, when your bones become soft, they fracture easily, right? So, any like damage would be become serious. And yeah, a side note, vitamin D is fat soluble. So we've covered a water soluble vitamin and a fat soluble vitamin. Sorry, water soluble. So fat soluble vitamins can be stored in the body in our fat reserves. Right? Any questions?
No.
All right. So tomorrow we'll pick up with talking about different minerals, dietary roughage, water, and then we'll see whether, like, whether we are able to, and to what extent are we able to talk about digestion. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. See you tomorrow.
Okay. Allah Hafiz.
Allah Hafiz.